It's been a long time since I did one of these deck profiles, but I'm super excited to showcase you guys my new take on Lianorn Masques for the current meta of Cardfight Vanguard. Lianorn Masques is one of the new mask units that we had coming out for this set, and I was super excited to see this card get debuted in the anime. With her introduction giving us 5 attacks for the deck, giving us early Persona Ride, as well as being a high power Vanguard still, I'm super excited to showcase you guys my thoughts on Lianorn Masques and my current take on the deck with the build that I have. Now, I definitely think that Lianorn Masques is one of those decks that people are still figuring out and aren't entirely sure what to do with her. There are cards that feel right, and there are some cards that people are still teching, and there are some other deck builds I've seen for her. But I really do think that Lianorn Masques is in that spot of, it's a very strong card, but the build for her is still like iffy. And I get it, this current meta is definitely an interesting one. Decks like Ava, Chronojet, Gondiva running around, Minerva's still strong. Like, the matchups for Lianorn that she's going up against, everything that she's playing against, I totally understand why people aren't really confident in this deck right now. However, I think that we should always give something a try, not knock it before we do try it. So I took my chance with Lianorn Masques, and this is the build that I've come up with for her. Now, moving on to camera 2, I'll go ahead and showcase my build. But before I do that, I need you guys to like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget that notification bell so you guys are subscribed to my channel. With that being said, card fighters, thank you so much for continuing to support the Prime Vanguard channel, and we will go ahead and start this deck profile. Starting off with our new ride line, we are playing the Roroa ride line and OG Lianorn. Now, the Roroa ride line has been very imperative for this deck. Being able to maintain in the soul so that we can use it for our other card effects later in the game, important. The biggest thing about this ride line, and one of the reasons why I've switched over to this versus going back to Gracia and Rectina, is because from my experience with Lianorn Masques, this is a deck that wants you to push early. It's really imperative, especially in this current meta, that you are able to push early before Gondiva starts blowing up your board, before Ava starts knocking out your rear guards and builds up a lot of card advantage, and then Chronojet just snowballs into something crazy. Making her lovely debut on the channel, I am playing 4 copies of Servitude of Funeral Procession Lianorn Masques. Now, Lianorn Masques is an insane card. This card gives us 5 attacks, retires unit on our opponent's board while giving us a card back from the drop zone. All of these things are very imperative, and they do come up. Lianorn Masques being a mask card as well means that we are able to access Persona Ride if we go second, or go into her as a new Vanguard on our first turn to get those extra 5 attacks to push. With this deck, you want to go into Lianorn Masques as soon as possible because all of your cards are built around her. The 5 attacks are extremely important, as this is how we are able to rush and break our opponent down before going into their first grade 3 turn, or to get that Persona Ride benefit on our first Persona Ride turn to push really hard against them. The 5 attacks only cost 1 CB, which means that we're not expelling a lot of resources on this card either. And since we're not staying on old Lianorn, maybe just for her first ability to get extra deck filtering going on, we're able to expel our resources to other cards that can help push on the rear guard prior to getting that second wave of attacks with Lianorn Masques. The biggest flaw about this deck doesn't even feel with the deck itself, it's really just the current meta that we're in. With decks like Chronojet, Ava, and Gondiva being able to easily clear out entire boards, this card does get worse over time as the game goes on. Since you don't have the extra drive check to build up your hand, you're really forced to play into a hard rush style with this deck, which is perfectly fine because of how overdress is and numbers and defending. But without a full board, that's where this deck really becomes weak at. If you don't have multiple targets, or if you can't restand a column, it does hurt in that sense. Lianorn Masques is an incredible asset to Lianorn archetype and style of play. I do think that this card has received a lot of hate simply for the fact that a lot of people just don't know what to do with her yet. I think the 5 attacks are very welcome, the Persona Ride is very welcome, the Mask of Hydrogam is a very powerful order card. Her first and second ability are also very strong, as it gives you a body back on the board, and you're getting 5 attacks for a counterblast of 1. I just think that because of the current meta that we're in, she does feel worse right now. Lianorn's support as well that she got in this set was also not very strong either, and I think that really hurt her chances of being a successful deck. But I do think that if you understand your matchups, you understand how to manipulate and control your resources, this deck does have the potential to succeed, and with future support, Lianorn Masques is going to be a card that you're going to want to watch out for. For my next grade 3, I am playing 1 copy of the OG Lianorn. For Lianorn Masques' first ability to work, you have to remove a Lianorn out from the game, and if you have to go into that extra turn with her, or you have to wait one more turn to get the Persona Ride off, being able to trigger her abilities a second time is very imperative. You can knock out key pieces your opponent will have on the board, and then also use this card as a rear guard target to call out, or a Persona Ride target if you're stuck on old Lianorn, but that's never happened to me ever since I picked up this deck. 2 copies of Mask of Hydragam for my last grade 3. It's a mask card, you need it to get the Persona Ride early, it moves itself into soul, and it filters out the deck, and it's a target for another card, which makes your filtering, your searching, and your soul charging just way more consistent. Going into my grade 2s, I am playing 3 copies of Tideline Dragon. Tideline Dragon is without a doubt one of the MVPs of this deck. Being able to give 10,000 power to itself and another rearguard on a Persona Ride turn means that Lianorn Masques will hit that threshold onto the rear guards of where they're strong enough to get past damage triggers and make magic numbers against your opponent. If you acquire Dragon Tree markers with your Depth Welleth in this deck, you can also turn these cards into magic numbers, and with the effect of the other cards we place in this deck, reaching these cards to get them past the 33,000 threshold that your opponent will be at, whether they're on damage triggers or they're using other card effects, is not very difficult to do. Being able to push as hard as you possibly can on the Lianorn Persona Ride turn is imperative to this deck's success. For my next grade 2, I am playing 3 copies of Dragon Tree Wretch Depth Welleth. Now, Depth Welleth is a key piece to search out your Mask of Hydragam. In this deck, it is extremely imperative that we reach our Lianorn Masque as soon as possible. You do not want to stay on old Lianorn because this deck is no longer built to maintain her, and it's not viable to stay on her. Now, if you go first and with the old Leonor and your hand is bad, that might be an excuse to do that, but using your Depth Welleth to push as a key piece in the early game to attack with and filter out your deck out for Mask of Hydragam makes it a really solid card. For my last grade 2, I am playing 4 copies of the new Love Binding Maiden Margaret. Now, Margaret is one of the Ride Father discard targets based off her ability, and it's very imperative for this card. It's honestly insane. The first ability to Soul Blast 1 and draw a card just makes our ride line make a lot more sense, as once you get past your Roroas from 0, 1 to 2, you don't really need them anymore in the soul because they're not reliant on having each other in the soul after you get to grade 2. Then, her second ability is what makes this card insanely good. Being able to counterblast and paralyze your opponent's entire front row as well as preventing them from intercepting is a big deal. In your Ava matchups, when you're on that Lianorn Masques Persona Ride turn, calling this card out and taking those obscurities away from them means that that's minus 20,000 shield from their front row. And the Ava deck, while it does build up a lot of cards in hand depending on how they build it, taking out 20,000 shield from their front row as well as getting extra power-ups from Persona Riding and doing 5 attacks in a turn is very strong indeed. Moving on to grade 1s, I am playing 4 copies of the Stoicheia PG. Now, I want to explain this. I actually am not a fan of Elementaria in this deck for Lianorn, and the reason being is because if you were ever in that desperate situation where you needed that extra body on board to reach the threshold for her skill, you have all of these to rely on. So therefore, it being a target you can call out makes it better than being on Elementaria, in my personal opinion. But if you want to go to Elementaria, you can obviously take one of these out and turn it into that. Now, this is where things get weird, but just stay tuned with me. My grade 1 lineup is very unique, and I think that this is where Lianorn shines at. So starting off, I'm still playing 3 copies of Performing Petal Diantha. Now, Diantha has always been a staple to me in Lianorn for the simple fact that, especially in this build, for the simple fact that her being able to counterblast 1 and generate you an extra body on board with this deck and this current meta is very important. Diantha being able to call back your Tideline Dragons that you discarded, or call out your Margarets whose effect works on place, or call out the other grade 1 targets I will showcase in the deck, is imperative to your winning strategy. She's also a strong booster as well as a strong attack target, meaning that if we need to move this card forward or if we need to have this card stay in the back row to make strong boost columns, we can do that. And it works out very well on your OG Leonorn's turn too. This way, if I have to stand my Leonor because I went first, and it just makes more sense to me to do everything I need to do going the turn after, because that's when this deck really shines, is when you get Persona Ride off, then I have a card that makes not staying on the OG Lianorn feel vanilla. I just think that if you have to deal with your board being retired a lot and you have a card that can give you an extra body on board and then that other body can turn into something else, this card becomes really solid. I don't like the idea of playing the order card to do that because this is not a mask build that is using the Prison Dragons, which I will showcase at a different time. It's not a mask build that's using the Prison Dragons, so I just think that having Diantha is way better. Okay, so now for all the tech pieces. I'm going to showcase the first one, which is the 2 copies of Boro Mushrooms. Again, I'm playing the mushrooms for two reasons. One, these mushrooms move themselves into the soul and give you 2 plant tokens. Now that is a big deal because plant tokens are 5k bodies that allow you to turn them into boosters or attackers. And this card is a grade 1, meaning that we can use it on the early game Aroa turns to push hard on our opponent. Or we can also call this card out with Diantha from her ability to get the full back row we need to activate our Lianorn Masque. Next up, I'm playing 2 copies of Prized Trident. Ever since I saw Amalia, I was happy that we could have Countercharge in Lianorn, and I don't think Amalia is a bad card at all. I just simply think that because this deck uses a lot of resources to function and work, and you're basically using everything to make this deck function at its full power, being able to use your soul for something else is more important than using your soul to give you another resource for later in the game. Prized Trident is a card that moves itself into the soul and gives you a counter charge, so it does its job. And because we are a deck that does 5 attacks, on that 5th attack you'll just get it into the soul, and then you get to counter charge as well. It doesn't cost a soul blast, and I don't even care about the 5,000 power because you can't really use it except on your Lianorn attack anyway. So for that particular reason, I just think that Prized Trident is just better because I can use the soul for something else. But if you want to play Amalia over this, you can. I'm not against that. For my last grade 1 slot, I'm still playing 2 copies of Forest Protecting Hunter Prosper. I have seen every single Lianorn Masques deck cut this, and I can see why. I definitely do think that you need to focus on getting the bodies onto the board and just maintaining that because of the current meta. However, because you have Lianorn Masques' first ability, you play Diantha as well, and you play the OG Lianorn, I think that Prosper still has a place in the deck. The card turns itself into giving you additional 5k booster, and after you've swung with your rear guards and you use this to boost for your Lianorn, you're giving 5k to the front row units that are in front of it, which means that once they restand, the additional power they'll have from the persona riding and trigger effects, and on top of the 5k means that you're hitting a magic threshold with those cards. On top of that, this card gives you a soul charge when placed, so it is another card that fills in your soul, and while at that point it might not be needed, the fact that we just have that makes it a lot better. I still think that Prosper is a very important piece for this deck, and it's not one you'd have to convince me to cut this card. I do think that people should still be trying and consider it and be, experimenting with their grade 1 lineup with Lianorn Masques, and I think that Prosper has proven itself to be a very solid card for this deck still. Now for my triggers. So my trigger lineup is, full on just aggro. I'm playing 4 copies of the generic heal triggers. I'm playing 4 copies of the Melodia Pomera for crits. I'm playing 4 copies of Aspiring Maiden Alana for crits. And then I've switched over to using 3 front triggers, which is the Frenzied Heiress, and then 1 copy of the Best OT, which is the Blessed Favor. Lianorn Masques is a deck that does not want to play the long game. You're not trying to sit there and play a long game with anybody. Crits and front triggers are all cards that give you that imperative push that is needed to work. If you see a crit trigger in the early game, you're setting up even better for your Lianorn Masques turn. Front triggers on your Lianorn Masques turn when you get those 5 attacks means that once it's active, that second wave of attacks will just be a lot better, even if your opponent pulls a damage trigger. We also have 3 swings going on when we go first or when we go second, so that this way we can start pushing our opponent depending on what our matchup is. So you're always going to have a full front row, whether it be tokens or whether it just be cards you call out from hand. So these front triggers just got a whole lot better. Now the front trigger thing you can switch out for draw triggers. I just don't like draws because I want my units to be able to push as hard as they possibly can. And while it does take away from the hand and you're not going to have the largest hand because you're going back to regular drive checks, you're still doing 5 attacks and you're pushing hard in the early game. So I think that being able to take advantage of that is super important. That is the conclusion of my Lianorn Masques deck profile to you guys. Tell me your thoughts and feelings on my deck. I feel as though my Lianorn Masques deck is a very unique one. I understand that a lot of the card choices that I've made and a lot of card choices that I have in there are not very similar to what a lot of people are playing for their Lianorn decks compared. I just think that it's a deck that you have to try all the different grade ones that you can, and the solid ones that were strong in the old Lianorn, I still think you can take advantage of in this Lianorn. And it was nice to try some cards out that I've never tried before, including the new ones. I think that Margaret is a staple addition, as well as Tideline Dragon. I think that those cards have proven themselves to be very powerful for the deck, as well as the depth well of grade 2 feels great, but I think that the grade 1 lineup is definitely one that we need to experiment with, as well as our grade 3s, and potentially potentially maybe bring Prison Dragon back. I really love that card, and if you guys want to see me create a Lianorn Prison Dragon deck, I'll be willing to put in the work for you guys. With that being said, card fighters, I'll take off and I'll see you soon. Peace.